That morning, she sat in the back row of the courthouse, her black dress simple and clean, nothing like the expensive mourning attire that wealth could buy. The widow's chair was hard against her spine, but Grace Martinez had grown accustomed to discomfort. 6 months after burying her husband, she was here to fight for the right to grieve him. The courtroom smelled of old wood and bitter coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, unforgiving glow. Grace kept her hands folded in her lap, her wedding ring, a simple silver band, catching the light. Across the aisle, the Blackwood family occupied the front rows like they owned the building itself. Colonel James Blackwood Sr. sat rigid in his dress uniform, his chest heavy with decades of medals. His wife, Patricia, wore pearls that cost more than Grace had earned in a year. Their daughter, Victoria, was scrolling through her phone, bored by the proceedings that would determine Grace's future. They whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing back at her with the kind of disdain reserved for unwelcome insects. Grace had married their son, Sergeant Michael Blackwood, in a small ceremony at the courthouse 2 years ago. No family present, no fanfare. Just Michael in his dress blues and Grace in a white sundress from Target. He'd insisted they didn't need anyone's permission to be happy. Now, as she sat alone in this room full of strangers, she wondered if happiness had ever been enough. The legal documents before the judge were thick and official, bound in blue covers that seemed to weigh more than they should. At stake were Michael's death benefits, the small house they'd shared off base, and the life insurance policy he'd taken out when they got married. Everything that remained of their brief, perfect life together. Grace's lawyer, David Chen, was young and earnest, working pro bono from a legal aid clinic. He'd warned her that this wouldn't be easy. The Blackwood family had hired Morrison and Associates, the kind of firm that charged more per hour than Grace made in a month. Their lead attorney, Richard Morrison, looked like he'd stepped out of a men's fashion magazine, silver-haired, confident, and utterly without warmth. "Your Honor," Morrison began, his voice filling the courtroom with practiced authority, "we are here today to correct a grave injustice. The defendant, Miss Martinez, has fraudulently claimed benefits belonging to the Blackwood family through a marriage that was nothing more than an elaborate deception." Grace felt the words hit her like physical blows. Fraudulent deception, the same accusations that had been whispered behind her back at the funeral, when she'd stood alone at Michael's graveside, while his family formed their own circle of grief that didn't include her. Mrs. Blackwood was a convenience store clerk when she met the deceased. Morrison continued, turning to face the gallery as if addressing a jury of public opinion. A woman with no education, no family, and significant debt. She targeted Sergeant Blackwood specifically because of his military benefits, his insurance policies, and his family's standing in the community. The words painted a picture that wasn't entirely wrong, but wasn't right either. Grace had been working 2 jobs when she met Michael, the convenience store during the day and cleaning offices at night. She did have debt from her mother's cancer treatment. She didn't have family. Her mother had died 6 months before she met Michael, leaving Grace completely alone in the world. But the way Morrison told it, these facts became weapons against her character. Furthermore, Morrison continued, Miss Martinez isolated Sergeant Blackwood from his family, manipulated him into cutting contact with those who loved him, and convinced him to change his beneficiaries just months before his deployment. This was not love. Your Honor, this was predatory behavior. Grace closed her eyes, remembering the last fight Michael had with his father. It wasn't her fault, but she'd been in the room when it happened. Colonel Blackwood had called her that Mexican girl and suggested Michael was thinking with the wrong head. Michael had stood up so fast, his chair fell over. "Don't you ever talk about my wife like that again," he'd said, his voice deadly quiet. "Grace is twice the person any of you will ever be." The colonel had laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Wife, you think this little arrangement is going to last? She is using you, son. Can't you see that?" Michael had taken Grace's hand and walked out of his childhood home. They never went back. Now, 6 months later, Grace was being forced to defend not just her right to grieve, but her right to have loved at all. Morrison pulled out a thick folder of documents. The evidence shows a pattern of manipulation and financial targeting. Miss Martinez researched military benefits extensively before meeting the defendant. She had previously dated 2 other service members, relationships that ended when those men were deployed. She specifically frequented establishments known to be popular with military personnel. Grace's cheeks burned. The rare search had been a Google search after her friend Maria mentioned that military spouses got good health insurance. The previous relationships were 2 dates with guys she met at a bar near the base, neither of whom she'd seen again. The frequenting establishments was working at a 7-Eleven that happened to be on the way to Fort Bragg. Every normal thing she'd done was being twisted into evidence of manipulation. Your Honor, the Blackwood family doesn't dispute that a marriage ceremony took place. What we dispute is the validity and intent of that marriage. This was a business transaction disguised as love, and Mrs. Patricia Blackwood, who raised 4 children in service to this country, should not be denied her son's final gifts because of one woman's greed. Patricia Blackwood dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. She was a professional widow, Grace realized, someone who had made an art form out of military sacrifice. Her husband had served, her sons had served, and now she was collecting the sympathy that came with loss. But Grace had been the one holding Michael's hand through video calls when the nightmares started. She was the one who learned to recognize the signs of his PTSD episodes, who researched therapists and support groups. She was the one who sent care packages and wrote letters every day, who kept their little house ready for his return. Patricia Blackwood had sent a birthday card. Judge Margaret Riley was a stern woman in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. She'd been listening to the opening arguments with an impassive expression, but Grace caught her glancing back several times. Not with curiosity, but with something that might have been recognition. "Mr. Chen," Judge Riley said, "I assume you have a response to these allegations." David Chen stood up, and Grace felt a flutter of hope. He was young, but he'd spent weeks preparing for this case, working late nights in his cramped office above a Chinese restaurant his parents owned. "Thank you, Your Honor. The plaintiff's characterization of my client as a predator is not only false, it is offensive to every military spouse who has ever been questioned about their motives for marrying someone in uniform." He walked to his table and picked up a manila folder, much thinner than Morrison's elaborate presentations. "Mrs. Martinez. And yes, she legally took her husband's name upon marriage, met Sergeant Blackwood at a 7-Eleven, where she was working to pay off medical debt from her mother's cancer treatment. She was not trolling for military benefits. She was trying to buy insulin for a diabetic co-worker who couldn't afford her prescription. The detail was small, but Grace saw Judge Riley's eyebrows raise slightly. It was true. Grace had been counting out crumpled dollar bills and quarters, trying to scrape together enough money for Mrs. Patterson's insulin. Michael had been behind her in line, and when he realized what was happening, He'd quietly handed the cashier a 20. "That is the kind of woman my client is," Chen continued. "Someone who gives what little she has to help others. And that is the woman Sergeant Blackwood fell in love with." Morrison was already shaking his head. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Chen is telling a story, not presenting evidence," sustained Mr. Chen. "Please stick to the facts." Chen nodded. "The facts are these. Sergeant and Mrs. Blackwood were married for 18 months. During that time, Mrs. Blackwood worked 2 jobs to support their household, while her husband was deployed. She sent him letters daily, care packages monthly, and visited him on base every opportunity she had. She attended therapy sessions for military spouses, participated in family readiness groups, and integrated herself into the military community. Grace remembered those meetings, sitting in circles of folding chairs in community centers, listening to other wives talk about the challenges of military life. Some of them had looked at her suspiciously at first, the young Mexican girl with the thick accent and the thrift store clothes. But she'd shown up every week, had offered to babysit for other wives who needed a break, had organized care package drives for deployed soldiers. Furthermore, Chen continued, the allegation that Mrs. Blackwood isolated her husband from his family is demonstrably false. We have text messages showing that Mrs. Blackwood repeatedly encouraged her husband to maintain contact with his family, even after they had made their feelings about the marriage clear. That morning, she sat in the back row of the courthouse, her black dress simple and clean, nothing like the expensive mourning attire that wealth could buy. The widow's chair was hard against her spine, but Grace Martinez had grown accustomed to discomfort. 6 months after burying her husband, she was here to fight for the right to grieve him. The courtroom smelled of old wood and bitter coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, unforgiving glow. Grace kept her hands folded in her lap, her wedding ring, a simple silver band, catching the light. Across the aisle, the Blackwood family occupied the front rows like they owned the building itself. The text messages were painful to remember, Grace begging Michael to call his mother on Mother's Day, even though Patricia had refused to speak to her at the wedding. Grace suggesting they send Christmas gifts to his sister's children, even though Victoria had never acknowledged her existence. The truth is, Your Honor, that Sergeant Blackwood's family cut him off when he chose love over their approval. Mrs. Blackwood was not the cause of that estrangement. She was the casualty of it. Morrison was taking notes, his pen moving quickly across a yellow legal pad. Grace knew he was preparing his rebuttal, finding ways to twist these facts into more ammunition against her. As for the financial allegations, Chen continued, Mrs. Blackwood signed a prenuptial agreement waiving any claim to family inheritance or property that predated the marriage. The only benefits she stands to receive are those that Sergeant Blackwood specifically designated for her as his spouse, benefits he had every legal right to assign. The prenup had been Michael's idea, a way to show his family that Grace wasn't after their money. She'd signed without reading it, trusting him completely. Now she wondered if that trust had been naive. Your Honor, this case isn't about money. It is about whether a legal marriage can be invalidated retroactively because the deceased's family disapproves of his choice. It is about whether a widow can be stripped of her rights because she doesn't fit someone else's idea of a suitable military wife. Chen's voice carried a passion that surprised Grace. She'd worried that his youth and inexperience would be liabilities, but he understood something the expensive lawyers didn't. This wasn't just a legal case. It was a fight for her right to exist in the space Michael had made for her in his life. Judge Riley nodded slowly. Thank you, Mr. Chen, Mr. Morrison. I assume you'd like to present evidence supporting your client's position. Morrison stood with theatrical precision. "Indeed, Your Honor. I'd like to call Mrs. Patricia Blackwood to the stand." Patricia Blackwood walked to the witness box like she was approaching a podium to give a speech. She placed her hand on the Bible with practiced solemnity, and Grace noticed the way the court reporter looked at her with sympathy. Even here, Patricia commanded respect that Grace would never receive. "Mrs. Blackwood, please tell the court about your relationship with your son, Michael." Patricia's voice was steady, refined, with the slight southern accent that marked her as military aristocracy. "Michael was my youngest son, and perhaps my most sensitive. He had a big heart which made him vulnerable to people who might take advantage of his generous nature. Did you have concerns when he told you about his relationship with Miss Martinez?" "I did." Patricia's eyes flicked toward Grace with practiced disdain. Michael had always dated educated women from good families. Suddenly, he was talking about a convenience store clerk who barely spoke English. Grace felt the familiar sting of shame. Her English was fine, good enough for 2 jobs, good enough for community college classes, good enough for the love letters she wrote to her husband every day. But in Patricia's mouth it became another mark against her. "Did you discuss these concerns with your son?" "I tried to," I suggested. "He take things slowly, get to know her better before making any permanent decisions." But she had already isolated him from us. Our phone calls became shorter and less frequent. He stopped coming home for holidays. It wasn't true, not entirely. Michael had stopped coming home because every visit became an interrogation about Grace, a series of pointed questions about her family, her background, her intentions. He'd told Grace about the conversations, about how his mother would suggest he was being manipulated, that real love wouldn't move so fast. "Were you aware that your son changed his benefit?" "Not until after his death." Patricia's voice broke slightly, and Grace felt a stab of unwelcome sympathy. Whatever else was true, Patricia had lost a son. "When we tried to make funeral arrangements, we discovered that everything— his insurance, his military benefits, even his personal effects— had been left to someone he'd known for less than 6 months. The funeral. Grace remembered standing at the back of the church, watching Patricia greet hundreds of mourners who had known Michael as a child, a teenager. A young man, Grace had known him for 18 months, but in some ways, she felt like she'd known him better than anyone in that room. She knew he liked his coffee black in the morning, but with cream at night. She knew he talked in his sleep when he was stressed. She knew he cried during animated movies and laughed at commercials with talking animals. But 18 months felt like nothing compared to 28 years of motherhood. "Mrs. Blackwood, in your opinion, what was the nature of your son's relationship with Miss Martinez?" Morrison was leading her toward the conclusion he wanted, and Grace could see Patricia understanding her role. "I believe Michael was lonely and vulnerable after his deployment to Afghanistan. He was dealing with trauma, and he was stationed far from home. Miss Martinez recognized an opportunity and took advantage of his emotional state." The words hung in the air like smoke. Grace wanted to stand up and scream, to tell them about the night she'd held Michael while he shook from nightmares, about the way he'd smile when he saw her waiting for him at the airport, about the morning he'd proposed with a ring he'd bought with his own savings, not his family's money. Instead, she sat quietly, letting the prosecution build their case against her character. "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwood. No further questions." Chen stood for cross-examination, and Grace held her breath. "Mrs. Blackwood, how often did you visit your son after his marriage?" Patricia's composure flickered slightly. "We were not invited to visit." I see. And how often did you call him? Our son was busy with his military duties. We didn't want to interfere. So you had no first-hand knowledge of his day-to-day life with Mrs. Martinez. I had a mother's intuition. Did you attend their wedding? Patricia's jaw tightened. We were not invited. Actually, Mrs. Blackwood, weren't you invited, but you declined to attend? Morrison was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative. Sustained. Chen tried a different approach. Mrs. Blackwood, when was the last time you saw your son alive? Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Christmas, 2 years ago before he met her. So you hadn't seen Michael in over a year before his death. We had scheduling conflicts. Whose schedule, yours or his? Objection. Sustained, Mr. Chen. Move on. Chen looked frustrated, but he pressed forward. Mrs. Blackwood, are you familiar with the term Family Readiness Group? Of course. It is a support system for military families during deployments. Were you a member of your son's unit is Family Readiness Group? Patricia hesitated. Those groups are primarily for spouses. And Mrs. Martinez was a member. I believe so. In fact, she was secretary of the group, wasn't she? She organized care package drives, managed communication trees, and provided support for other military spouses. Patricia looked uncomfortable. I wouldn't know the details. But this doesn't sound like someone who was isolated from the military community, does it? Objection calls for speculation sustained. Chen was building a picture, piece by piece, but Grace could see he was fighting an uphill battle. The judge was listening, but Patricia Blackwood was a sympathetic witness, a grieving mother with decades of military service behind her. Grace was an outsider, a young woman with an accent and no money. The morning stretched into afternoon as Morrison called more witnesses. Victoria Blackwood testified about how different Michael had become after his marriage, how he'd stopped calling home as frequently. Colonel Blackwood spoke about his son's promising military career and how family support had always been crucial to that success. Each witness painted the same picture. Michael had been a devoted son until Grace came along and changed him. When Chen called Grace to the stand, her hands were shaking. She'd practiced her testimony for weeks, but sitting in that chair with all those hostile eyes on her felt like being under a spotlight. Mrs. Martinez, Chen began gently. How did you meet your husband? Grace's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. At the 7-Eleven where I worked. He was buying coffee, and I was trying to help a co-worker get her medication. Tell the court about that interaction. Grace looked at the hostile faces in the gallery, then focused on Chen's encouraging nod. My co-worker, Mrs. Patterson, was diabetic, but she couldn't afford her insulin. I was counting out my tip money, trying to help her buy it. Michael was behind me in line, and when he realized what was happening, he paid for it without being asked. What happened next? He came back the next day, and the day after that, always buying coffee, always leaving a big tip. One day he asked if I wanted to get dinner. And you said yes. Grace smiled for the first time all day. I said I couldn't afford dinner. He said he wasn't asking me to pay. A few people in the gallery chuckled, and Grace felt a tiny bit of her tension ease. Tell the court about your courtship. Michael was kind, patient. He helped me with my English homework for my community college classes. He fixed my car when it broke down. He never made me feel ashamed of where I came from or what I didn't have. Did he talk about his family? Grace's smile faded. Sometimes he said they had high expectations. He was worried they wouldn't understand why he loved me. Did you encourage him to maintain contact with them? Yes, I thought if they got to know me, maybe they would see what he saw. Morrison was watching her carefully, taking notes for his cross-examination. Mrs. Martinez, why did you marry Michael so quickly? Grace had known this question would come, but it still felt like a punch. Because we were happy, because he was deploying, and we wanted to be married when he left. Because when you find love, sometimes you don't want to waste time waiting for other people to approve. Tell the court about your marriage. We were poor, but we were happy. I worked 2 jobs while he was deployed. I saved every penny I could, so I could visit him on base when he had leave. I wrote him letters every day, sent him pictures of home, tried to make sure he knew he had something to come back to. Did you ever ask him to change his beneficiaries? Number he did that on his own. I didn't even know about it until after he died. Chen paused, letting that sink in. Mrs. Martinez, what would you say to people who claim you married your husband for his money? Grace looked directly at Patricia Blackwood, and for a moment, the 2 women stared at each other across the courtroom. I would say they didn't know Michael. If they had known him, really known him, they would understand why someone could fall in love with him for reasons that had nothing to do with money. Morrison's cross-examination was brutal. He attacked every aspect of Grace's character, her motives, her background. He made her confirm that she had significant debt when she met Michael, that she had researched military benefits, that she had indeed dated other service members briefly. But somehow, Grace felt stronger under his assault than she had sitting quietly all day. This was a fight she understood. Miss Martinez, isn't it true that you specifically targeted military men because of their financial stability? No, sir. I met military men because I lived near a military base and worked at places where they shopped, just like I met construction workers and teachers and students. But you researched military benefits before your marriage. I researched everything about military. I wanted to be a good military wife. I read about deployments, about PTSD, about family readiness groups. I was trying to understand my husband's world. And wasn't part of understanding that world, learning about the financial benefits of being a military spouse. Grace paused, and the courtroom fell silent. Yes, sir. I learned that military spouses get health care, which I needed because I couldn't afford insurance at my jobs. I learned that there were death benefits, which scared me because it meant acknowledging that Michael might die. I learned about these things because they were part of the life I was entering. Morrison sensed weakness. So you admit that financial considerations played a role in your decision to marry? Grace lifted her chin. Financial security played a role in my gratitude for the marriage, but love played the role in my decision to marry. When the testimony ended, Judge Riley called for a recess. Grace sat in the hallway with Chen, eating a sandwich from a vending machine and trying not to think about how the morning had gone. You did well in there, Chen said, though he looked worried. It doesn't feel like it. They're going to win, aren't they? Chen was quiet for a moment. Patricia Blackwood is a compelling witness. She is grieving. She is sympathetic. And she represents everything this country respects about military families. And I am just a convenience store clerk who can't afford a real lawyer. You are a woman who loved their son when they didn't make time for him. But that might not be enough. Grace nodded, accepting the reality she'd been trying to ignore. The law was supposed to be blind, but money and status still mattered. Patricia Blackwood belonged in this courtroom in a way Grace never would. "There is one thing," Chen said slowly. "What?" "I've been going through Michael's personal effects that the military released to you. There are some letters, some documents. I hadn't wanted to use them because they're private. But given how the testimony has gone, what kind of letters?" Chen opened his briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope. "Letters Michael wrote but never sent, to his family, to you, to himself. The military found them in his personal effects after his death." Grace's heart stopped. "What do they say?" "I think you should read them before I answer that. If you want to use them tomorrow, we can. But once they're part of the public record, everyone will know what Michael was really thinking in his final months." Grace took the envelope with trembling hands. Whatever was inside, it was the last communication she would ever have with her husband. Reading it in preparation for a legal battle felt like a violation of something sacred. That night, in her cheap motel room, Grace spread the letters across the thin bedspread. There were 7 of them, written on different dates during Michael's final deployment. The first was addressed to his father, Faye Dad. Asterisk Faye, know you think Grace married me for money, but you are wrong. She married me despite the fact that I didn't have any. When we met, I was living paycheck to paycheck, sending most of my salary home to help with Victoria's student loans. Grace knew that. She married a broke soldier, not a rich man's son. Asterisk Feo taught me that honor means keeping your word, standing by your commitments, and protecting those you love. That is what I am doing with Grace. I wish you could see that. Asterisk Faye your son, asterisk Faye Michael Faye II was addressed to his mother, Faye Mom. Asterisk Faye you always taught us to judge people by their character, not their circumstances. Grace has more character than anyone in our family. She works 2 jobs, sends money to her elderly aunt in Mexico, and still finds time to volunteer at the animal shelter. She doesn't do these things for recognition or praise. She does them because she believes in taking care of others. Asterisk Fairy wish you could see her the way I see her. I wish you would try. Asterisk Faye Love. Asterisk Faye Michael Faye III letter was the hardest to read. Faye Grace asterisk Faye few are reading this. Something has happened to me. I want you to know that loving you was the best decision I ever made. My family will fight you on the benefits, the insurance, everything. They think you married me for money, but we both know the truth. Asterisk Fayu married a man who had nightmares every night. You married someone who couldn't afford to take you to nice restaurants. You married a soldier who might not come home. That wasn't about money. It was about love. Asterisk Fidon, let them take that away from you. Don't let them rewrite our story. Asterisk Faye forever. Yours, asterisk Faye Michael Faye Grace cried until her chest ached, clutching the letters like lifelines. Michael had known this day would come. He'd known his family would fight her, and he'd tried to leave her the ammunition she would need. The 4th letter was addressed to Victoria, talking about how proud he was of Grace for going to college while working full-time. The 5th was to his grandfather, describing Grace's care for her dying mother. The 6th was a long rambling letter about military life, but one paragraph stood out. Faitha guys here are always talking about Dear John letters, about wives who can't handle deployments. Grace is the opposite. She makes deployment bearable. She sends me pictures of home, not because our home is fancy, but because she makes it feel like a place worth coming back to. Asterisk the 7th letter was the most devastating. It was addressed to no one, just Michael working through his thoughts. I am scared I am going to die over here, and I am scared of what will happen to Grace if I do. She doesn't have anyone else. Her mother is dead. Her father was never around. She has no siblings. My family was supposed to become her family, but they've made it clear she is not welcome. If something happens to me, Grace will be completely alone. The benefits and insurance aren't about money. They're about making sure she has something to build a life on. She is still young, still smart, still kind. She deserves a chance to be more than a poor widow. Faye need to know that if I don't come home, I am at least leaving her with hope. Grace folded the letters carefully and placed them back in the envelope. Tomorrow she would have to decide whether to share Michael's private thoughts with a courtroom full of strangers, whether to expose his pain and fear to score points in a legal battle. But tonight, she held them close and remembered what it felt like to be loved unconditionally. The next morning, Grace felt different walking into the courthouse. She was still outmatched, still poor, still fighting an uphill battle. But she was carrying Michael's voice with her, and that changed everything. Chen had prepared Morrison for the existence of the letters, following proper legal procedure. Morrison looked confident, probably assuming they were love letters that would only prove Grace's emotional manipulation of a lonely soldier. Your Honor, Chen began. I'd like to enter into evidence several personal letters written by Sergeant Blackwood during his final deployment. Morrison was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. These letters are hearsay and highly prejudicial. Judge Riley looked intrigued. Mr. Chen, please explain the relevance. Your Honor, these letters directly address the allegations made by the plaintiff. They show Sergeant Blackwood's state of mind, his understanding of his family's objections to his marriage, and his reasons for the financial decisions he made. I'll allow it with the understanding that these are the decedent's personal opinions, not statements of fact. Chen handed copies to the court reporter and began reading the letter addressed to Michael's father. The courtroom fell silent as Michael's voice filled the room, defending his wife from beyond the grave. Grace watched Patricia Blackwood's face as her son's words painted a picture completely different from the one she'd presented yesterday. Patricia looked stricken, then angry, then something close to shame. When Chen read the letter about Grace making deployment, bearable Victoria Blackwood started crying. When he read Michael's fears about Grace being left alone, even some of the hostile gallery members looked uncomfortable. The final letter, the one about Grace deserving hope, fell over the courtroom like a benediction. Grace looked around and saw something she'd never expected. People looking at her with sympathy instead of suspicion. Morrison's rebuttal was weak. He argued that the letters showed Michael was emotionally compromised, that he was feeling guilty about abandoning his family for a woman they didn't approve of. But the damage was done. Michael had spoken for himself, and his voice carried more weight than any lawyer's arguments. Judge Riley called for a final recess before closing arguments. In the hallway, Grace overheard Patricia Blackwood talking to Morrison in sharp, angry whispers. You said this would be simple. You said we could prove she was a gold digger. Mrs. Blackwood, these letters complicate things, but they don't change the fundamental facts of the case. Those letters make us look like monsters. They make it sound like we drove our son away. That is not what they say. That is what everyone is going to think. Grace felt no satisfaction at Patricia's distress. The letters hadn't been weapons. They'd been Michael's attempt to bridge a gap his family had created. Now they were evidence in a war no one should have had to fight. Chen's closing argument was simple and emotional. He painted Grace as exactly what she was, a young woman who had loved a soldier completely and was now fighting to honor that love. Morrison's closing was technical and cold. He argued that emotions shouldn't override legal standards, that marriage required more than feelings to be valid. Judge Riley retired to consider her decision. 2 hours later, they were called back to the courtroom. Grace's hands were shaking as she stood for the judge's entrance. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence, Judge Riley began. This court finds that the marriage between Michael Blackwood and Grace Martinez was legal, valid, and entered into with genuine intent by both parties. Grace felt her knees buckle, and Chen steadied her with a hand on her arm. While the court understands the plaintiff's grief and their concerns about their son's choices, there is no evidence that Mrs. Blackwood engaged in fraud or deception. The evidence shows a young woman who entered military life with genuine commitment and who honored her marriage vows even under difficult circumstances. Patricia Blackwood was crying now, not the dignified tears of yesterday, but raw, ugly sobs of loss and defeat. Furthermore, the letters written by Sergeant Blackwood provide clear evidence of his mental state and his reasons for designating his wife as his beneficiary. These were not the decisions of a manipulated man, but of a soldier trying to provide for the woman he loved. Judge Riley looked directly at Grace. Mrs. Blackwood, you are the rightful recipient of your husband's death, benefits, and insurance proceeds. This court sees no basis for the plaintiff's claims. The gavel fell with finality, and Grace sank into her chair, overwhelmed by relief and exhaustion. Outside the courthouse, Patricia Blackwood approached her one last time. She looked older than she had the day before, diminished by defeat and grief. I lost my son twice, Patricia said quietly. Once when he married you, and again when he died. I thought if I could take back the first loss, the second wouldn't hurt so much. Grace looked at this woman who had been her enemy and saw only another person destroyed by grief. Mrs. Blackwood, you didn't lose Michael when he married me. You lost him when you made him choose between his family and his love. Patricia flinched as if she'd been slapped. He was my baby, my youngest. I wanted to protect him. From what? From being happy. Patricia had no answer for that. She turned and walked away, leaving Grace standing alone in front of the courthouse that had become her battlefield. 6 months later, Grace was working in a different kind of building. She'd used part of Michael's life insurance to open a support center for military widows, offering legal aid, counseling, and financial planning services. She'd kept enough money to buy a small house and finish her degree, but the rest went toward helping other women navigate the system that had almost destroyed her. The center was small, just a few rooms in a converted house near Fort Bragg, but it was always busy. Grace had learned that she wasn't the only military widow whose in-laws had questioned her motives, whose grief had been complicated by legal battles and financial stress. Victoria Blackwood came to see her one afternoon, looking nervous and uncertain. I wanted to apologize, Victoria said without preamble, for what we put you through, for what I said about you at the trial. Grace set down her coffee and studied Michael's sister. Victoria looked genuinely remorseful, but Grace had learned to be cautious about sudden changes of heart. What changed your mind? I read Michael's letters, all of them. Mom didn't want me to, but I demanded copies after the trial. Victoria's voice was thick with emotion. He loved you so much, and he was disappointed in us. Grace nodded. He wanted you to love me too. Not because I was perfect, but because loving me made him happy. We were scared, Victoria admitted. Michael was always the sweet one, the one who saw the best in people. We thought someone was taking advantage of that, instead of trusting that he was smart enough to know the difference. Victoria wiped her eyes. Dad won't admit it, but the whole thing destroyed him. He knows he was wrong, but he is too proud to say it. Mom blames herself for Michael's death now. She thinks if we hadn't pushed him away, maybe he wouldn't have re-enlisted. Grace felt a stab of unexpected sympathy. She'd been so focused on her own loss that she hadn't considered how the family's guilt might be eating at them. Michael re-enlisted because he believed in service, Grace said gently, not because he was running away from home. Would you consider having dinner with us sometime? All of us together. I know it is a lot to ask, but Michael would have wanted his family to know his wife. Grace was quiet for a long moment. The family that had tormented her, that had tried to strip her of everything Michael had left behind, was asking for reconciliation. I'll think about it, Grace said finally. But not because I need your approval or your acceptance. If I have dinner with your family, it will be because Michael loved you, even when you hurt him. Victoria nodded, understanding that this was as much as she could hope for. That evening, Grace sat in her small house, looking through photo albums from her marriage. 18 months wasn't very long, but they'd packed a lifetime of love into those days. She had pictures of Michael in his uniform, pictures of them at the courthouse on their wedding day, pictures of their tiny apartment filled with second-hand furniture and fresh flowers. She thought about Patricia Blackwood carrying her grief and guilt like stones. She thought about Victoria, trying to make amends for assumptions that couldn't be taken back. She thought about Michael, who had died believing his family would never accept the woman he loved. Grace pulled out a piece of paper and began to write, "Fay dear Patricia. Victoria came to see me today. She told me you blame yourself for Michael's death. I need you to know that is not true. Michael died serving his country, doing what he believed was right. That had nothing to do with our marriage or your feelings about it. Fayu raised a son who was kind, brave, and loyal. Those qualities made him a good soldier and a good husband. You should be proud of the man he became, even if you couldn't approve of the woman he chose. Fay Michael wanted us to be family. He dreamed of Sunday dinners and holidays where all the people he loved were in the same room. We can't give him that dream while he was alive, but maybe we can honor it now. Fay, if you are ready to know me as Michael's wife instead of fighting me as his mistake, I am willing to try. Fay sincerely. Fay Grace Blackwood Fay. She sealed the letter and addressed it to Patricia Blackwood, knowing it might be rejected or ignored. But Michael had taught her that love was worth the risk of rejection, that reaching out was better than staying isolated. The legal battle was over, but the harder work of healing was just beginning. Grace had won the right to call herself Michael's widow, to receive the benefits he'd intended for her. But more than that, she'd won the right to define their love story on their own terms. In the end, that was all she'd ever wanted. The simple recognition that what she and Michael had shared was real, valuable, and worthy of protection. The law had validated her marriage, but time would validate her love. Outside her window, the lights of Fort Bragg twinkled in the distance, and Grace thought about all the military families struggling with separation, loss, and the complicated politics of love across class lines. Tomorrow, she would go back to her support center and help other women fight battles similar to the one she'd won. But tonight, she sat quietly with her memories and her grief, holding space for a love that had been worth fighting for.